Let me clarify this.
Yeah.
For somebody who isn't an educator,
Yes.
someone who is in education, we have kids, right? And the concept here is that if you could identify children who had special needs, maybe they were a little behind in the social area, or they were a little behind in the locomotive area, they weren't quite walking, they weren't talking. First thing was to identify that, correct? And then the idea, if I have this right, was that you would get them in a program where you could work with them and get them up to speed so that by the time they hit kindergarten, first grade, they were right in there learning with the rest of them. Is this kind of the idea?
Well, that would be the goal. That's still a goal. For many children, the largest number of children, those who are at risk or mildly disabled, that's a possibility. We have other programs to serve young children who fall in those categories. Head Start came along, again actually in the 1960s under the Johnson administration. And it took Head Start a long time to develop what would be considered effective intervention programs. But it was designed for kids who are at risk because of poverty. And so we have those programs in the state today. But certainly for many of the children with speech and language problems or mild learning problems or mild motor problems, et cetera, and or social emotional immaturity as it relates to social development and things like that, the notion of providing services for kids, early childhood education was that was the goal. That is what we're about. And that's not just the public schools. That's also high quality private child care or / early childhood education centers that would be part of that movement to provide for kids and get them ready for school. But there are many children with moderate to severe disabilities who they're kids who have the potential for learning, who are we're not able to easily access them to promote academic learning, but that they benefit from being with other children, acquiring social skills. They benefit from being with other children because they have an opportunity to learn to communicate in natural environments. They get opportunities to move, and then they're provided with very specific kinds of assistance, guided by classroom teachers and assisted by speech and language pathologists and physical therapists, et cetera, that become part of that environment which they're in school, and the services are provided in the schools for those purposes. It doesn't mean that they don't get service sometimes in these private child care centers or with programs such as West Central Wisconsin United Cerebral Palsy. There are all kinds of related services that are being provided in other situations too. So if you went to Green Bay, for example, you might find it used to be called the Association for Retarded Citizens, ARC. It's a different term now, but they'd be providing services for some young children. United Cerebral Palsy would be providing services for other kinds of children. St. Vincent's Hospital over there would be providing services for others. And the public schools might have an overlap. So there are all kinds of groups and agencies that participate in this particular process.
So this evolution that was going on in the 50s, 60s, 70s was this philosophy that, these kids can learn, they are teachable, and that they are worth teaching. I mean, this was kind of an evolution that people had to believe in this first, and then had to convince culture that this was something worth paying for and incorporating into the school system. All these things had to be done.
Oh, that's right. I mentioned the Milwaukee Project, but there were a couple educational psychologists that working in Iowa at the time, and Skeels and Skodak. And it's reported that, and I know that this is the case, that there were children placed in residential institutions who they appeared to be cognitively disabled, but they weren't because they had no way of expressing themselves. Had placed a couple infants in a center, and because there wasn't room to have placed them with younger children, they placed them in an environment where they had adolescent and adult persons with cognitive disabilities. And over time, they watched that these two children who exhibited these behaviors were changed, developed differently, and it was, they hypothesized it was due to the fact that they had all this stimulation, even from cognitively disabled adults. One of the two, Skeels and Skodak, and I can't remember which one it was, but in the early 1970s received a recognition from the Council for Exceptional Children for doing this. And these kinds of things began to spin out. We became aware of the idea from researchers that perhaps there was a window of opportunity during the young children's lives that gradually closed, that you could achieve more during the periods of time when the kids were undergoing the greatest amount of growth and development, 0 to 2, 0 to 3, 0 to 4, than you could from 4 to 8 or from 8 to 16. And we began to get data that suggested that for kids with disabilities, that for every dollar that was invested in special ed early childhood, 15 would be saved over the lifetime of kids in school. We've seen even more dramatic things like that with kids who are at risk, with quality early childhood education programs, where the kids who finish those programs haven't been in those programs. They finish high schools at higher rates. They go on to post-secondary schools. They pay taxes. All kinds of things like that, which have been demonstrated since that time to support the notion of investing in kids when they were young. Now, I'm happy to say that we've actually learning a lot more since the 1970s. We're finding, for example, that adults can benefit from intervention. And not just adults who exhibit disabilities, but persons who aren't disabled from the standpoint of maybe depression and other kinds of conditions, with the right kinds of interventions, cognitive therapies and things like that, rather than quickly just going to pharmaceutical, that they can benefit. There's some evidence that in fact stimulation, even in older individuals, alters how the brain functions. So intervention started with infants and toddlers, but we're beginning to see the emphasis on what we can do with even adults to this day. So that research has supported that particular notion that the best time to intervene is during these periods of greatest growth and development and things like that. There was out of Ypsilanti, Michigan, years ago, a child development specialist, highly regarded by the name of David Weichart, began to develop a curriculum for kids who are at risk, and conducted a very interesting series of studies where they placed children in 4 different types of curriculum models. And the models were defined by the amount of teacher direction which was involved in the model, et cetera, and a variety of other variables, and began to follow those kids for some of them up to 20 and 30 years. And these kinds of research projects have demonstrated that in fact it can make a lot of difference. The Federal Reserve about 8-9 years ago discovered this. And out of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, where had specialists gathering data and doing synthesis and looking at what was coming, and they came right to this campus and made a presentation about the value of early intervention, early education, to business community here. That saves money, and the state of Minnesota has made a major investment in trying to bring the business community in to support early education of all children, etc. And that's what we have now. We have in our own state the pre-K 4 programs, and making early education available to all kids. Early education has been available to kids upper middle class for years. There are places in St. Paul to this day, in Minneapolis, where it costs more to send your child to childcare, early education, and I'd better say that early education / childcare, than it would cost to pay tuition at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. People invest in that, and they've always been doing that. So this there's research to support the fact that by altering the experiences of young children, disabled or non-disabled, we can in fact help them be more successful in school and become more act and involved citizens in their communities.